Tēnā koutou katoa and hello everybody. Welcome to the Lento Intervention podcast. My name is Ben Adelberg and I'm coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland.
And g'day, I'm Emma Strutt and I'm currently coming to you from Gungaloo country in Queensland. Before we dive into our conversation today, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community.
The Lento Intervention is an Australasian educational and advocacy platform dedicated to raising awareness about the current climate and health crisis.
And on this podcast, we invite guests to chat about topics that will inspire you to take action to improve your own health and the health of the planet.
So please subscribe to and share this podcast and visit our website for the full show notes.
And don't forget to buy us a coffee if you'd like to support our work.
Conversations based on science to raise awareness about our growing climate and health crisis. That's what we're about, and our recent episodes have certainly gone deep into some key areas. Now, in this episode, we are hoping to focus a little more on solutions, achievable solutions. Or are they? Emma?
Dum, dum, dum. So today we're sitting down with Dr. Jack Santabarbara, a retired CEO and academic who wears many different hats, including author, environmental activist, peace activist, and philanthropist. For many years, Jack has been writing about and focusing his work on topics such as environmental concerns, economic models, energy concerns, social justice, sustainability, all very big topics to unpack. So Ben and I are very much looking forward to this conversation. I think it'll be a very thought-provoking discussion today. Jack, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. I look forward to our chat.
Now, you are a referral from Dr. Mike Joy, I'm going to say a loyal supporter of ours. And so high expectations, but before we no pressure. But as I always say, like a good story, we always want to start with a bit of a background, get to know our guest. And as Emma alluded to in her intro, you have your fingers in so many pies, have had in so many pies as well. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your life journey.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the reasons I've done so many things is because I'm so old. It gives you lots of opportunities to try different things. I sort of started my education with a PhD in experimental social psychology and did a PhD in conflict resolution. And I followed that up with some academic work, teaching and studying, and then started doing some consulting around various things, largely program evaluation type things, evaluating social and health programs. And this is back in Canada, many decades ago, a long time ago. But along the way, I married an Australian gal who came to Canada to study. And we had a child around the time that Ronald Reagan was talking about a winnable nuclear war. And I remember Joanna holding Jeff in her arms and saying, "This is not good. And I need to do something about it." And so she was a physician. And so she joined the Physicians' Peace Movement. It was an international group that actually won the Nobel Peace Prize back, I think, in '85. Again, a long time ago. But that experience brought us in touch with a number of physicians from around the world, including physicians from the third world, and Nicaragua in particular, which is, as you're aware, one of the poorest countries on the planet. And we were invited to visit our friends there, which we did. And that was a real eye-opener. You know, it's one thing to read about poverty and see pictures about it, but to actually be there and experience it firsthand was quite a shock in some ways, but also an incredible education, and help us to understand what was really going on. And what our friends helped us to understand was that a lot of the problem was with the developed world and the way we were developed and developing and basically exploiting them and keeping them undeveloped. And that got me interested in alternative economic systems, which then brought and led me to the topic of ecological economics. And I don't know whether you've come across that topic. It's to be distinguished from environmental economics. They're two quite different branches. Environmental economics, which is something people are generally more familiar with, basically looks at this whole issue of externalized cost. You know, if a coal plant spews out pollution and dirties someone's laundry, that's an externality that the coal plant doesn't pay for, and the families whose laundry's dirty has to rewash it and they pay for it. Well, as you're well aware, there's a whole range of externalized costs. And what environmental economics largely tries to do is to internalize those costs, is to count them. And while there's some value in that, there's also quite a few problems with it, which I won't go into because it's probably a bit of a side issue. But I just wanted to distinguish it from ecological economics, because environmental economics basically accepts all of the assumptions and premises of neoliberal economics, our dominant economic system. Whereas ecological economics takes a totally different approach. It really reconceptualizes economics and tries to base it in science. That's where the ecology comes from. And even though it's ecological, it has a strong input from physics and thermodynamics. And again, we won't get into that because it's probably a bit too esoteric. But the point is, it's an economic system that takes into account the realities of the real world, which our current economic system does not do. That's perhaps the most important thing to appreciate. And so it really looks at the whole issue of biophysical limits. You know, if we're going to have an economy to meet our needs, how do we do that in a way that recognizes what the biophysical limits are? So coming back to sort of my personal story that you asked about, is as a result of learning about ecological economics and trying to understand, you know, how our dominant economic system was actually having an impact on the broader world. I saw it primarily in social terms. But when I started a business and ran it for 20 years or so and sold it because I got interested in doing more in this area of ecological economics, even though I'm neither an ecologist nor an economist. But what interested me was the whole issue of limits to growth. You know, I had read the book, Meadows, The Limits to Growth, and I understood it, but I always thought it was something in the future. And then when I sold my business at the end of the last millennia, I took a course in climate change at the University of Toronto. And it just blew my mind because I realized for the first time that we had actually gone beyond the limits of the natural world. And whereas I had thought it was always going to be something in the future and that we could avoid it if we were wise enough, to realize that we had actually reached these limits, and that, you know, our human activity, our economic system was responsible for altering basic human life support systems that evolved on the planet, was pretty shocking. And so that led me to, you know, look at the climate issues, and that inevitably brings you to the energy issues, because energy, of course, drives everything. And that was the second big shock because it came to realize that the sort of future that we had anticipated and was the sort of dominant theme of what our future is going to be, about unlimited growth and progress and all these wonderful things, when you realize that the role of fossil fuels in the development of our current civilization and the fact that fossil fuels are, first of all, non-renewable. So at some point, they're not going to be available. But more than that, to realize that a topic that really loomed up large for me was net energy analysis. And is that something that's familiar to you, folks, or has been talked about in your series?
Definitely in our talking points to delve a little deeper in that for sure.
Yeah, well, it's a very simple concept, although it's largely ignored. But the concept is simply that it takes energy to produce energy. And, it's kind of like a paycheck. You get a gross pay, but then you have all kinds of deductions. And what you take home, which you can actually use, is your net pay. Well, net energy is like that. Net energy is the energy we actually get to do things with in society. Build roads, keep our houses warm, whatever we need, we use energy for. But in the early days of fossil fuels, the net energy return was in excess of 100 to 1. So, for 1 unit of energy that you use to get oil, you got 100 units back. If you imagine your bank account like that, it'd be pretty nice return. So there was really not much point in distinguishing between gross and net because it was minuscule difference. It was magic. Because previously, prior to the fossil fuel era, when we relied on wood and animal power, largely a little bit of wind, maybe windmills, but we maybe had 15 to 1, 20 to 1 at most. So we were going from that 15 to 1 to 100 to 1. It was like magic suddenly to have this. We think of gas as cheap, or as petroleum as expensive. But when you think that even if you pay $3 for a liter of petrol, how far can your car go, your vehicle, on 1 liter? Maybe 30 kilometers, depending upon your fuel efficiency. Well, think of pushing your vehicle 30 kilometers and the amount of energy involved. And would you do that for $3? Is that the way
I was
you'd spend
thinking the
your?
amount of calories it would take me to run 30 Ks and the amount of energy bars and gels and all that. Definitely not $3.
Exactly. Well, think of pushing, a 2,000 pound or a kilogram, vehicle that distance, and that's what $3 of petroleum does for us. It's magic, really, when we sort of step back and think about it. And we're the engineers who work in the petroleum industry are very clever, so they knew how to get the easiest to obtain energy early on. They went for the easy stuff. And now our net energy from petroleum or from fossil fuels in general is down from 100 to 1 to currently around 20 to 1 or even less. So we're actually approaching what the pre-fossil fuel era net energy return ratio was. But it's been hidden because we don't feel it because we rely so much on embedded energy. I mean, here we are using this complex high-tech computer system to communicate with each other in 3 different locations. And think of all the embedded energy and all of the, not just our headsets and our PCs, but our homes, the furniture in them, the power system that keeps them, lit and warm and so on. So we're living with an enormous amount of embedded energy that we've used over the last century and a bit, but primarily in the last 70 years. It's really if you look at the curves, the uptake is really very sharp around 1950. That's when petroleum started to be used in larger and larger, ever larger quantities. And that's when population increased. It's when GDP increased. It's when water uptake increased. It's when a whole range of things changed and happened. And now we're in a situation where we have to deal with a whole range of things. Ben, you talked about solutions. We want to talk about solutions. Well, we're in a predicament that I'm not sure has the kind of solutions we're used to. You look at a problem, you do some problem solving, you do some brainstorming, you come up with options, you choose the best, and hopefully you can eliminate the problem. Well, we've gotten to a point where we may be beyond that, and we're going to be suffering some of the consequences, and that's what's really scary, and but hopefully also motivating for people, because you know there's something about in the communication industry, you talk about you have to be positive all the time. Yes, but we also need to understand the value of fear. Fear is a human response that evolved to give us a warning about something. So it's a signal that you need to pay attention. It's a signal. It's our bodies and our minds alerting us to the fact that there are risks approaching and that we need to take action of some sort. So I think it's important to be able to face the challenges that we face and understand them in some depth in order to know what our best course of action is. But it may not be the kind of simple solution where it's going to eliminate something. But I think there are many things that can be done to reduce the risk and to make the future livable. But having said that, it's going to take some pretty dramatic changes in mindset, I think. And some of the biggest challenges are between our ears, and how we perceive things and look at things. Climate change is the perhaps the best understood of our major global challenges at the moment because of the attention it's been getting, over the last many years. But this isn't unique with me. I'm really following some scientists who are saying that there's a more basic problem of which climate change is only one symptom. And there's a whole range of other symptoms, biodiversity loss being another, pollution of air, water, soil, another. I was just reading an article yesterday about nanoparticles and how pervasive they've become. And scientists really don't know a lot about how they're going to act on biological systems. So we've created all these things that pose existential risks to us. And the biggest concern that I have is that so many people are looking for solutions in the wrong direction. And the biggest one perhaps being the whole idea of renewable energy. And I know that was on your list of topics that you wanted to chat about. And we know from the climate research that we have to stop using fossil fuels. They're altering our global climate systems, and I'm sure you and your other listeners are well aware of the dramatic consequences of that, especially if it goes unchecked, and if we don't use the very small window of time that we have to reduce emissions and bring atmospheric levels down. But people seem to be confused about whether they can do that without replacing the energy that currently comes from fossil fuels. And I think it's incredibly important to realize they're two quite different dynamics and processes. We can stop using fossil fuels without replacing everything with renewable energy. So that's one point I think that bears some contemplation and looking at. The other thing about renewable energy is that it's not renewable. It's a misnomer. It's a huge misconception about how renewable energy technologies work. Let's take solar and wind, the most common, and there's so much in the news about how inexpensive they've become, which is true, and they work brilliantly. I mean, we live off grid. We have for 15 years, and manage with about a fifth or less of the average New Zealand energy consumption, just because you don't need it all, you know. But the point I want to make about so-called renewables is that while the technology is there, it's usable technology. It's becoming increasingly less expensive, but it's not renewable. Okay, the sun and the wind are renewable. I mean, as long as the sun is in the sky, we're going to have solar power and wind. I mean, everything goes back to the sun. Wind is generated by weather patterns caused by heating. It's the technology that's used to capture the sun and the wind that requires mining, that requires rare elements and minerals. And you can't do that without fossil fuels. We're in a bind. At a time when we need to be reducing our fossil fuel use, people are talking about increasing its use to do what we're doing now, but in addition, build up a renewable energy infrastructure to replace fossil fuels. And there's several problems with that are really important for people to understand. I want to come back to net energy as one of the important issues with respect to that. And all so-called renewable energy sources have lower net energy returns than fossil fuels. Solar is about 10 to 1. Wind with the very large turbines can be up to 18 or 20 to 1 is probably the highest. The only exception to that is dams, water power from dams, hydroelectric power. Yeah. But even those are not really renewable in the same sense because dams eventually silt up. So they may be very long term, they may be usable for more than a century, but what do you do after that?
And there's this challenge of storage as well. The solar and the wind blows great, but hang on, what if it blows at the wrong time of the day or the week when you need the peak power usage,
exactly.
and solar's only on a sunny day.
Exactly. And the technology to do the storage, again, while there's, every day you can look at the news and see innovations in it, but it all requires mining and rare elements and minerals. There's a Spanish group of researchers. I think they're in Barcelona. They've done a lot of work for the EU on renewable energy, and they have very, very sophisticated computer modeling where they're able to look at climate issues, energy issues, economic issues, all within the same simulations. And they've done a simulation looking at the replacement of fossil fuels with renewables, so-called renewables. And they looked at different levels of replacement, 50% replacement, 75, 100% replacement. And what they find is a couple of really major findings. One is that the amount of fossil fuels needed to build the system would push us over the 2 or 3 degrees warming that we need to avoid. Okay, so that's one bind. The other bind is that while individual solar panels and wind turbines have the net energy return that I just quoted you a minute ago, if you add the element that you mentioned, Ben, storage, there's again lots of energy inputs required, lots of mineral inputs. So if you look at the net energy, not of individual units, but of an entire renewable system, the net energy return reduces to less than 5 to 1, which is lower than pre-fossil fuel era.
Because you lose a lot as well in
Well,
that
that's it.
process.
I mean,
Yeah.
absolutely. And this hydrogen stuff, I mean, hydrogen is not a fuel, it's a battery. You have to put energy into it to get energy out. And whenever you do that, whenever you transform from one system to another, there's a loss involved. So hydrogen is net energy negative. You're always going to lose energy in a hydrogen system. So it's quite inefficient, which doesn't mean it doesn't have a role, but it's going to have a very narrow application where direct use of, say, solar or wind, will not make sense. So there's that issue as well with renewables. And in addition, there's the whole issue of rare earth minerals. There's actually he's an Aussie, but he's currently in Finland working with the Finnish Geological Survey. Simon Michaud. He's I think he's a geologist. He's worked in the energy field for quite a while, and he's been looking at the global supplies of these rare earth minerals, and there just ain't enough. If the amounts required by the ramping up of a renewable replacement system were to be used, or the amount needed is in some cases in excess of the known reserves for those particular minerals.
Oftentimes, it's done in poorer regions of the world too, isn't it? Where corporate responsibility is a bit questionable. So then you're opening yourself
Social
up to a whole
injustice.
host. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, even
Displacement of communities.
well, there's that, but there's also the other aspect is that if anyone's going to get access to whatever minerals are available, it's going to be the wealthy northern nations. But again, we're going to be using those at the all the injustices that you talked about in terms of the mining and whatnot, and the displacement of native peoples. But they're not going to be able to have the same technology. We're going to be depriving them of the same technologies that we're going to be developing. The point I wanted to make was that in terms of renewable energy systems, there's the issue of low net energy, there's the issue of storage, there's the issue of rare earth minerals, there's the justice issue about whose land those rare minerals and so on are on. But there's another one, and again, this is often ignored, but these things wear out. A wind turbine, I don't know what its life is, but let's say it's 30 years or 40 years, and you've got to renew that entire system, producing energy globally or nationally. I mean, here in New Zealand right now, people are talking about increasing the electricity system by about at least 70 to 80%, and using fossil fuels, and it's just clear, so clearly, so obviously unsustainable from an ecological perspective, putting aside all the social injustices and inequalities and so on. It's staring us in the face, but the technology is so sexy and so seductive that we go for it. We've relied on technology. We're using technology. Technology is wonderful. It's magic, but it's not our future. It's not our long-term future. And this is what is, I think, very shocking to, people who really want to grapple with these issues and understand them, of how different, life needs to be. And it sounds scary, but it doesn't have to be scary. It's only scary because we haven't really thought about the alternatives. And we can get into that if you like. But why don't I stop there? I kind of been going on and give you a chance to you know ask any questions about clarifications or taking them in a direction that you think would be helpful. Yeah.
We've got a number of questions. Emma, do you want to go first? Because that's we
No, go
banked
for
them
it.
in our heads.
You had one stored up before.
I did. I mean, look, there's a number of questions, and how far back do we go in this discussion so far? But it's the externalities that you've made reference to a little earlier that we don't take into account, and you've spoken about the net energy cost or the cost or net energy or the cost of energy. You mentioned one thing. I mean, this is more clarification because you mentioned that the net energy for petroleum used to be 100 to 1, and that's now down to about 20 to 1, maybe even 15. The first question, why is that? Because of fracking and the difficulty of now extracting more of that crude oil out of the ground, or what's
Yeah.
pushed that cost up, or that ratio down rather?
Yeah. Well, many people have seen the old oil wells from the early part of the oil era. There'd be these huge wooden tower structures, and there'd be oil spurting out the top. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's what is called conventional oil. And conventional oil is where there's oil and gas mixed together in the ground. And the engineering task was quite simple. You figured out where the deposit was and you poked a hole in the ground. And then you stood there with your containers and it got pushed out and you just collected it. And that's why it was 100 to 1. It was truly magic. Well, every oil well generally has more oil than gas. So before all the oil is pushed out, the gas is dissipated. Okay, so it runs out of gas before it runs out of oil. So what the engineers do is to pump other gases, even like carbon dioxide or even water. I mean, Saudi Arabia pumps seawater into Ghawar, which is one of their largest fields. So pumping that gas or oil or water into the wells to push the oil out takes energy. So that reduces the net you get back. Okay. But that's still with a conventional well, and it happens to every conventional well on the planet. And most of the conventional wells have peaked in most nations where they were producing conventional oil, mixed with gas, have peaked in terms of the volume of production that they have. So the engineers have now turned to unconventional sources. This are deep sea, for example, Arctic drilling, tar sands, fracking. I mean, just think of the deep sea oil wells. Think of those enormous structures. They're like tiny cities on stilts that, are out there in the ocean. And they may be a couple of kilometers above the ocean floor before they even get to the soil where they then drill down below the ocean floor a few more kilometers. All of that takes enormous amounts of energy. The Canadian tar sands, which is an enormous deposit in terms of size, imagine a beach impregnated with oil. That's what it's like. The oil doesn't flow. It has to be heated the sand that they dig up has to be heated with natural gas in order to make it flow through pipes. The Canadians have actually considered building nuclear reactors up in the Alberta tar sands to provide the heat to warm the tar sand gas. Fracking, it's shale oil. It's oil impregnated in rock, so that it has to be blasted apart, often using high pressure systems and liquids that then contaminate water sources. So there's huge amounts of energy inputs to these unconventional sources, and that's what changes the net energy equation. There's another really interesting to me and an important point I think about it, and that is that the people that research these things, and there's several groups around the world that do this kind of research on net energy, have a hard time getting data about this stuff, because some of the largest oil producing companies are national companies. They're owned by sheikdoms or basically private parties. So they don't have to disclose certain kinds of information from which these sort of data can be analyzed. So that's part of the problem. There's just not good. Well, there's data that's good enough to get a general idea of what's happening, and there's clearly a decline in net energy from petroleum. There's also enough data about natural gas, and that's also declined. In fact, both petroleum and natural gas peak energy, peak net return, okay? Not peak volume, but peak net energy return is already passed. Like we're never going to have the same net energy return from petroleum or natural gas that we have in the past. Peak net energy return for coal hasn't happened yet. And that's one of the reasons why we haven't felt the decline from the other fossil fuels as much as we will in the future. But coal is projected to peak in net energy return terms anytime in the next 2 decades. So within your lifetimes, it's going to happen. And that's going to be very dramatic, because all the fossil fuel sources will have passed their peak net energy return features. And that's going to mean a dramatic decline in net energy available. And you have to also think about net energy per capita, because obviously the more people, having to share diminishing energy resources. That's why we're having conflicts, wars. Many wars have been resource wars. So that's why net energy returns are changing.
Well, the cheap energy is certainly, in the last maybe century, it's allowed society in general to increase the quality of life. So we've probably seen a greater proportion of middle income, because cheap energy, we're able to make more stuff. It's more readily available, but that means then the demands long term, we've got a high proportion of our global population that now needs that higher energy. And when you talk about our reliance that we don't realize, but our reliance on coal, New Zealand still imports a considerable amount of coal into the country. Australia still exports a fair amount of coal globally. And I know there's been more recent activity where, trying to reduce the amount of new coal mines and so on, but that is a reality. And if we still haven't hit the peak coal or peak net energy, then yeah, we're in for a considerable amount of trouble. And the other thing with the whole replacement of the like for like, because that's all we're doing. We're replacing a combustion vehicle with an electric vehicle. But again, going back to your point about the externalities, you know, we've covered it already, but all the impact implications of creating that vehicle, and more importantly, the batteries that have a limited lifespan, we can potentially, maybe if we have enough minerals globally, to replace the whole global fleet, but we can't replace that once it's past its 5-year lifespan. Who knows of a battery?
Yeah.
What do we do with that? So I think, yeah, there's been a lot of positive, perhaps, with this cheaper energy, but it's now creating a bigger reliance that we're going to feel, or it's going to result in a greater impact on society globally.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the this is the big dilemma and irony, really, in many ways that we face. Um, I mean, fossil fuels have given us enormous opportunities and features and technologies and growth. Um, but you know, in fact, I've just written an article about this in terms of how economic growth can be uneconomic. And again, this is not, you know, my idea. I'm parroting the ecological economist on this. But if you look at the economic growth is all about increasing GDP, right? And it only counts expenditures. It doesn't count costs. So the cost, for example, of associated with climate change are not included. I mean, if you couldn't run a business that way. You couldn't run a business by only counting your income and not counting any of your cost. And yet we run our economies based on GDP by only counting economic activity, but not the cost associated with that economic activity. Now, I'm just talking about dollar costs, never mind the other value issues that, you know, go way beyond the dollars. Um, I mean, how do you count in dollar terms the impact of climate change if we exceed 3 degrees Celsius? You know, I mean, it's you can't measure it. It doesn't make sense even to think about that. Um, well, it does make sense to think about it, but it doesn't make sense to you know, assume that we can get away with it. We do those things. So there's lots of evidence actually that the net outcome of our economic activity is a loss. So economic growth in terms of GDP growth, because the costs are actually greater than the benefits, it's a net loss. So it's uneconomic in that sense. You know, that's one of the paradoxes of our time.
What should our goals for the economy be then? Like if we're hyper focused at the moment on growth and it's a more, you know, linear model to allow for the well-being of people and planet, what should we be transitioning to?
Well, you've said it, well-being of people and planet, and you know, there's a lot of recent work on well-being. You're probably aware there's a well-being alliance, a global well-being alliance, and there's a group in New Zealand, well-being alliance group. But and you're probably aware as well that in New Zealand we have a well-being budget. Our Treasury Department has been developing a well-being budget, and I think those are really important initiatives. The concerns I have about them is that they do not focus on what to me should be the priorities, and that is there's again an entire research area on basic human needs. These are needs that transcend time and culture, so that they're universal in the sense that if you're human, you know, you need food, water, shelter, uh, companionship, You need a place in community, a role in community. You need a voice in community. You need a sense of identity in terms of relating to that community. These are all needs that are expressed quite differently in different cultures over different periods of time, but they're still basic human needs. And while there's some, academic arguments about, exactly what might be included or excluded as a basic need, there's enough consensus on the core that to me it's a really useful framework to think about basic human needs because we take them for granted in the highly industrialized complex society that we have, and we assume that, well, that of course those are going to be looked after. We can deal with the more esoteric, more refined, kinds of issues. But if we're really moving to a lower energy future, we need to start thinking about how we use energy. We are incredibly wasteful of energy. I mean, our most basic energy source is food, right? And we waste 30 to 50% of the food from the farm is wasted. And it's done quite differently in different parts of the world. In poor countries, they lose a lot to storage. Mice and rodents and vermin get into it. But in developed countries like ours, most of it is wasted between the supermarket and the garbage can. We grow here in our home as much of our own food as we can. We rarely have a meal that doesn't involve several items from our garden or our storage. And to me, wasting a little tiny item of food is one of the biggest sins you can commit. And yet we take it for granted because food used to be cheap and it's getting more expensive, and that's just going to continue. But understanding what our basic needs are and working together to ensure that those basic needs can be met in an equitable fashion, to me, is one of the big conversations we have to have in communities of all sizes. Whether it's a neighborhood or a state or a region or a nation and globally, because we've been indoctrinated. I don't know if you folks or your listeners are familiar with a BBC documentary called, let me hope I can remember the name. Yeah, it's The Century of the Self. It's a documentary about the role of the marketing and advertising industry in the developed world and how it has indoctrinated us to expect that our wishes, not our needs, but our wishes would be fulfilled. And it's an interesting documentary because it very explicitly states that its purpose was to create these wishes beyond needs so that our technologically advanced manufacturing systems could be continue to be productive by producing stuff that people would then demand because it satisfied their wishes.
That way of thinking seems to be quite essential for continuing with economic growth, doesn't it? Making sure that people are buying things to keep the economy ticking over. So, what can we do as individuals to kind of start to change the dial here? What do we need to take on board?
Yeah, that's a really big question.
Whilst maintaining or increasing our well-being, I think that's important. We're talking about the well-being, but how do we do that?
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and you're quite right to focus on well-being. And I would again emphasize thinking in terms of basic human needs as opposed to, our more refined aspirations and idiosyncratic wishes. Okay, to me, that's a really, really important distinction. And it's going to take time for us to make that kind of transition and adjustment in our way of thinking because we're all spoiled. We're used to having our wishes. I mean, we may daily feel frustrated, frustrations, but if you step back and think about it, you know, um, we were incredibly privileged and spoiled. Um, if you look at the history of humans, we live, much more comfortably and at a higher standard than people could have imagined, even a century ago. You know, um, and that's partly, I think, why the whole issue of downsizing is so scary. And Emma, I think your question, I think, you know, uh, one of the most important things I think is our attitude toward these things. If we can accept the biophysical realities of limits to growth, and we can accept that we are way, way, way over limits. We're not just approaching these limits, we're way beyond them. So that we actually have to reduce our consumption by 80 or 90%. Okay. In terms of material consumption. Now that sounds really scary. And if you're thinking in terms of growing the economy and progress forever and technology will save us, it's heretical. But the science is there. Um, so trying to understand the real limits is one thing that individuals can do, and I think you folks are doing a great job with this series of podcasts to help people come to grips with that sort of thing. And we need many, many, many of these sort of things for people to really stop and think about, what life is about, what well-being is about, what a good life is about, because we have been conditioned to believe something that's a lie, or that was at least was possible with fossil fuels, but is not going to be, with the future. And this isn't going to happen tomorrow or, next month or next year even, but is a process. And so if you understand the process and can prepare yourself and your family and your friends and your community and go in the right direction, then you're going to make the best use of resources that you have available. One of the things that really bothers me about the idea of, the renewable energy system just allowing us to keep going the way we have been. And people talk about, oh, well, what about nuclear fusion? We can get unlimited energy from nuclear fusion. Well, one of the worst things that could happen to humanity and the planet is to have more cheap, abundant energy. I mean, look at the damage we've done with fossil fuels, you know. So trying to understand that these things are not conspiracy theories, they're not, the kinds of ideas that come from, um, I don't know what. I mean, there are scientists who are telling us that we're passing these planetary boundaries and that it's going to have consequences. There's good science behind this stuff. Yeah, there's all kinds of good stuff out there. Um, but it doesn't, because it's so counter to the existing system, it's marginalized. So people have to be prepared to be marginalized and go against the stream, if you will, to even understand some of these issues, nonetheless adapt to them. You know, But there's a whole other line of research to me I think is fascinating and very relevant here, and that is over the last few decades there's been a lot of research on what makes people happy. And I don't mean in a temporary way, but in a longer term, like life satisfaction type happy. And gives people a sense of having a satisfying life. And yes, we need certain mineral materials and energy levels to do that. But what's really, really interesting is that you don't need a lot of material and energy resources to meet your basic needs, because basic needs can be satiated, right? You can eat just so much, you know, you can be just so warm. You can be just so protected with a structure, with a shelter. Um, so one of the important things about basic needs is that they can, in fact, be fulfilled, whereas our wishes can never be. Where our wishes are endless, they're infinite. We have incredible creative imaginations. We can always think of something more that we might like. So if you look at the curve of say either income or energy, and over very low levels, there's a linear relationship between any kind of well-being measure, whether it's happiness or more objective measures of well-being like access to nutritional food. At very low levels of money or energy, there's a linear relation, but up to a certain level, it levels off. You go beyond a certain income or a certain amount of energy per capita available to people, and they're not any happier, or they don't get more nutritious food or better health care or better education. It levels off. And yet the levels at which it starts plateauing are way below what our nations or the developed nations use. For example, in energy terms, one of the units of energy is a gigajoules as a measure of energy. And there's lots of research that shows that about 100 gigajoules per person per year of energy is quite sufficient to provide lots of well-being measures, have well-being basically satisfied. 100 gigajoules per capita per person. North America, the per capita energy consumption is 350 gigajoules, 3.5 times. I don't know about Australian data, but New Zealand have one of the highest energy consumptions per capita. We consume about 200 gigajoules per person per year of energy. Double what we actually need. Okay. So understanding some of this, I think, is important, because to get to your question, Emma, which I really haven't forgotten, is what can people do? Again, a lot of it is understanding, taking the effort to listen to podcasts like you guys are doing, understand what these issues are, and realize that they're not as scary as the marketers would like you to believe, because the marketers want you to believe it's scary because suddenly their marketing is not effective anymore. Suddenly they don't get to, sell stuff and create needs that are artificial and things that are unnecessary, and GDP isn't increased. So, it sounds simple. In some ways it is, but it's very, very challenging, just because so much pressure and so many of our norms and institutions are oriented toward growth. Our money system doesn't work unless there's growth. So changes are needed in those big institutional things. But one of the things people can do is spend as little money as possible. The less money you spend, the less damage you do to the environment. The more you can become a prosumer. Have you heard that expression, prosumer? The combination of being a consumer and producer. And to me, one of the most important things people can do is learn how to grow their own food. Basic energy source. It's fun. It's pleasant being outside. It's healthy. It's local. It's cheap. There's and if you do it together with a group, it's all the more fun and more productive. It's actually more efficient to do things that way. So there's lots of things that can be done at a very personal level, but it's not like there's a formula. It's we're everybody's smart enough to figure out how to do these things if they have the right mindset. And the way people do them will be different, in terms of their circumstances and where they live and their histories and so on. So that's why I'm emphasizing the mindset as being so important, and rejecting the mindset that growth and technology is what we need. It's not. What we need is focusing on basic human needs, human well-being, and working together to achieve those things. And there's a lot that can be done. One of the things we're just this past weekend, we had in our little neighborhood here, we had a meeting, about a half a dozen of us, about a car sharing program. You're probably aware there's some companies now operating with car sharing programs, largely in big cities where the density, makes it feasible for them from an economic point of view. Well, I want to try to demonstrate that it's possible to do that in a neighborhood, where people can walk and, to a neighbor's to pick up a vehicle and use it. And if you have a system in place to car share, then it's also very easy to ride share. And so if you can actually reduce the number of vehicles that a group of families need, and you have fewer vehicles on the road, traveling less kilometers, then you're reducing consumption. Replacing our fossil fuel fleet with EVs is a ridiculous idea, because you've got producing EVs uses more fossil fuels than producing an ICE vehicle. So again, are we really going to build up an EV fleet across the planet with using fossil fuels at a time when we need to reduce them? That doesn't make sense. We have to think about reducing our consumption, spending less money, figuring out how to do things, whether it's clothing, whether it's food, whether it's shelter. There's lots of things that we can do together to do that.
Jack, you've done a phenomenal job in making us, the listeners, understand where the real problems lie. We always go on about effective communicators from the science community, and you certainly delivered on that as well. But I'm also conscious we need to land this plane.
Sure.
For me, one of the markers of I guess the benefits we've had in the last 100, 150 years because of this abundance of energy is life expectancy's gone up. But we also know concurrently, not that it's a direct effect, but in the medical system, there's an incredible amount of waste that comes from that. And that's a price to pay. There's a problem you go to hospital, you get fixed, but there's a lot of waste that comes from that. It's a very simplistic way of looking at things. The other thing, you talk about a lot of solutions. It's also very important not to fall in the trap of greenwashing. Something sounds sexy, looks sexy. Air New Zealand's just announced they're embarking on this mission of hydrogen fueled planes, etc., nets, carbon neutral, all that. But you have really made us understand where the truth behind a lot of those supposed solutions. Now, we understand how important it is. You talk about process, you talk about learning, you talk about adapting. All that takes time. But the reality is we don't have time. We've got a deadline. So my final question to you is, we know we need to embark on change. We know we need to start getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. And I only use the word uncomfortable because it's different to what we've become accustomed to. We know it needs to happen. My final question to you is, will it actually happen? And will it happen soon enough?
Well, I mean, that's not up to me, unfortunately. It's up to all of us. I think that's, I'm not sure what else I can say about that. It really is, it really
Yeah.
is, it's about doing what you're doing. Again, I've commented a couple of times on how important what you guys are doing with these podcasts and helping people, alerting people to these issues, because this is what it's going to take. It's going to take just repeating and repeating and repeating. And when I want to say a couple of things, about the greenwashing and the tech is going to save us stuff. Whenever anyone talks about a new energy technology, I always recommend to people, ask what the net energy return is of that new energy technology, because it's generally an ignored question and topic. What is the net energy return of that technology? And what would the net energy return of a system with that technology be? Because it's not just the individual unit. You have to look at it in terms of a system. And I told you about the work the Spanish group has done to show what the very low net energy from a system. If it's a company that's recommending it, is selling something, be very skeptical. Be very skeptical. If it's a community group doing something together, that's where I think we're going to see some real change. And the community groups who are doing stuff, whether it's a car sharing program or a community garden, or just helping each other with whatever, sharing tools, sharing knowledge. I mean, repair cafes, um, where people help each other fix stuff, rather than throwing it out or replacing it. Uh, lots is happening in those sort of informal areas, and it's going to be very hard to change the system. The system is so powerful, so ingrained, so dominated, so self-reinforcing, that we really need to, as much as possible, create new systems for doing things, for helping each other, for meeting our basic needs together. You know, now, I mean, I'm not advocating, going living in the woods and, isolating yourself, because it's not practical. But as much as, again, it's a mindset, you know, learn to not pay attention to advertising. you know, train yourself to avoid advertising. It's deadly. It's not your friend. um, find the community groups, and if there aren't any, start one. There's bound to be people in your community who are concerned about these issues, and are looking for ways of working with other people to do stuff. It's not going to be easy. People are people. There's always going to be conflict, but that's part of what it's all about. Is learning to work through those issues with each other. Because ultimately, it's not going to be government. It's not going to be business that provides the. I'm not going to say provides a solution that gets us out of this predicament. It's going to be working with each other and helping each other. That's I get would be my message.
Thank you so much, Jack. We really, really appreciate your time. This valuable conversation, and I know our listeners will probably have to listen to this 2-3 times to make some really good notes, but hugely invaluable. Very much appreciative of your time. So thank you.
Thanks, Jack.
You're very welcome. And again, thank you guys for doing what you're doing. Good on you.
Thank you for listening to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. If you found this interesting, make sure you subscribe and share it with your friends.